In South Africa, where the country's democracy was born out of a racist past, society is still widely divided, and the Rainbow Nation project seems unable to fix the economic inequality that persists. How do we move forward when the gap between those who have and those who don't have keeps widening? Activist Zulaikha Patel will be joining us a bit later. We also have political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng, who joins us now to discuss this further. I think we've spoken about this before. Mr. Ngoasheng, in terms of, whether or not we can call ourselves a rainbow nation yet, a fully fledged rainbow nation as South Africa?
I don't think that we can necessarily call ourselves a fully fledged rainbow nation, because that actually requires all of the colors in the rainbow to be recognized. And where we are is a situation where Black people continue to be marginalized in their own country, even though they are the majority. And this is shown in the ways in which Black people continue to be excluded from the economy, and Black people continue to be excluded out of most social life in South Africa by virtue of their inability to afford certain things.
And there's also, some words that, were put out there when the Constitution was put together, when our forefathers or those who fought for liberation were sitting in those rooms talking, right? As words such as reconciliation, the Rainbow Nation, radical economic transformation, etc. But it doesn't look like they can all exist, right? Sometimes even when you talk about radical economic transformation, you feel embarrassed to even say anything about that term because it's been so politicized.
Well, I mean, that the term has been politicized doesn't mean that we mustn't continue to talk about the need for, real economic transformation. It shouldn't even be radical at this point, because without the inclusion of Black people, this country called South Africa will cease to exist eventually, because you cannot have a situation where the majority of the people are excluded from the economy in perpetuity. That's just a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for violence, as we've seen. In July, we saw last year, and we continue to see violence and have been seeing violence for the past almost 30 years in different shapes and forms, precisely because of these unspoken and unresolved issues. We come from a violent past. We come from an unreconciled past, because in order for reconciliation to take place, you need the people who perpetrated the painful act of apartheid to actually come out and make the apology, and to actually actively work in ways that show that they do not want apartheid to come back. And when you see things that, like what happened in Stellenbosch last week, the video that came out last week of a white boy urinating on a Black boy's room and saying that, that's how Black boys are to be treated as far as he's concerned, it just shows you how far we are from the kind of reconciliation that we seek. Now, this is not to say that, there are many South Africans who are actively on a daily basis working and doing the inner work that's required to undo, unlearn, and rethink their whiteness, and rethink their white privilege and how they relate to people on the basis of it. But in the main, the majority of white South Africans are still not doing the work. And because of this, we're going to continue to see the kind of conflict between Black people and white people and colored people and Indian people that we see on a day-to-day basis in South Africa. And for as long as we also, continue to treat even racism as like, an event that happens on one day, rather than a continuum, a series of events that happen on a long continuum, we will not come close to developing solutions for the scourge of racism.
And Asanda, I want to talk about the term reconciliation, right? It doesn't seem very equal, and I use the word equal as well, but it doesn't seem very equal in terms of the burden to reconcile. In most cases, some people would say it falls on the Black people to always reconcile with whatever white people do. For instance, with Stellenbosch, like you said, a lot of people are saying, forgive du Toit, and other people are saying, but why must it always be Black people who are doing the forgiving?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly the problem that, as I said, we need the people who perpetuate the acts of violence that is racism. We need the people who continue to perpetuate stereotypes, continue to perpetuate biases, and continue to act in ways that have a direct impact on Black people and lead to racial trauma. Those are the people that need to be making the most effort because of their privileged status. The onus and the burden is on them. But what we've done is that as Black people, we've taken on this burden that's not ours, and we've made it ours, and we think it's our responsibility because we just simply want to live in a country that is peaceful and is reconciled. But we cannot reconcile with ourselves. I mean, we can do the work on ourselves, we can bring ourselves together and have unity as Black people, but we cannot reconcile on behalf of somebody. They have to do the work, and they have to be the ones that extend the olive branch, and they have to be the ones that start off by admitting that, there was something wrong with what happened during apartheid, and that apartheid was violent, and that it continues to affect the everyday lives of South Africans, and that its legacy is something that we're going to continue to work for generations to undo.
All right, let's bring in Zulaikha Patel. She is an activist, and most of you might remember her from, those years ago, not university, rather Pretoria Girls being in trouble for its hair policies, and she was one of the pupils in the front line. Zulaikha, welcome to All Angles, and thank you very much for your time. Now, looking at this conversation about the Rainbow Nation, how far we are, etc., the things that you went through, when you have a conversation with your mother and she tells you that those are the things that she went through as well, how does it make you feel?
Thank you for having me. A very good morning to you too. So for me, when I think of the Rainbow Nation as well, I see the Rainbow Nation as a failed project, as a project that should have not been a project in the first place, because the Rainbow Nation essentially has been a plaster that's just been put over a wound in the hopes that the wound would heal under that plaster. And now when you put a plaster over a wound, it goes septic, right? Instead of allowing the wound air to breathe and heal, right? And that wound would essentially be our country and the state that our country was in 1994, right? Because we've got a country here that almost goes into a civil war. What you now can't do is say, let's all unite and be one, because how do we unite when others live in vulgar wealth and are afforded privileges whilst others live in dehumanizing poverty? How? You can't unite people like that, right? And for me, when I think of the instances of how far we've come, and I look at our country and I look at the constant overt racism within institutions, institutionalized racism, systemic racism, and I look at how overt racism in general is in between the interactions between white individuals and Black South Africans in our country, one is angered quite a lot, because it in a sense feels like we're not moving forward and we're taking more steps back than we are taking steps forward. Because when I think of my experiences back when I was in high school and I compare them to that of an individual that lived under the apartheid regime and see no difference between those incidents, one must be quite angered, because as a country we're not moving anywhere, we're not moving forward. And that's primarily because power lies in the hands of a white privileged minority. And so how do you effectively change anything when even Black people don't have a sense of power in their own country? And I'm talking about serious power, like capital, financial, economic power, right? And so in terms of our country, one must be quite angered when you look at incidents like Stellenbosch and you would think that the time zones between Stellenbosch are different, and Stellenbosch assumes it's in 1652 and the rest of the country is in 2022. And then you look at incidents like at Effingham Secondary in Durban, where children, minors, were shot with rubber bullets, just primarily because they are young and they are Black, and somewhat that looks like a threat when a Black child simply uses their voice. It looks like a threat to a white individual that you have to shoot at young children, innocent children, with rubber bullets, and a child was dragged across the road. One must be quite angered because we're not moving forward as a country, and we're not moving forward because the structures are not changing, and we're simply just doing PR. That's it.
And Zulaikha, I want to stick to that notion of not moving forward and us, introducing things that shouldn't have been introduced in the first place. You were called to speak at that inquiry into racism in the advertising world, right? Clicks was brought up for their kind of adverts, etc. Something like that. Should we still be having such discussions in South Africa in 2022?
We can't even talk about should we or should we not be having such discussions in 2022, because when you look at our country, these incidents are overt and are constantly happening. So we can't avoid such having discussions. We must have such discussions, but we shouldn't just have talk shops and only have discussions only. We should have practical ways of how do we change how do we have structural systemic change in our country, because I've come to the realization that the reason why we're here in our country, one must accept that it's a range of issues, but they all stem back to the fact that our democracy is quite threatened right now, primarily because the way our democracy was founded was also not one that was quite for structural change. The negotiations. I've always asked myself, as a young person born post-94, who's also branded as a free young South African, I've always asked myself, in terms of those negotiations, were those negotiations centered around structural systemic change, or were they just merely centered around changing the faces of government, And I believe that we are here where we are primarily because we have never addressed structural change. And the Rainbow Nation ideology is quite flawed when we talk of structural change, because the Rainbow Nation ideology is one that we're not prepared for as a country. We can't talk of uniting, like I said, when there has not been structural change, and Black people still live in a country where they do not own land, have no access to economic capital, have no access to good quality facilities. A young Black child in the township has no access to a good quality school. There are children in this country that are still subjected to not using a toilet, to using a pit toilet, right? And those are Black children. And so one asks themselves questions such as, in a country like this, how are we expected to hold hands and have this kumbaya nation where we're united when you look at our circumstances, we're not all on the same boat. We're not all on the same boat. We're in the same sea, but we're not all in the same boat. Others are in boats, others are on cruises, right? And so I believe that we should not only just be having discussions. At the top of our priorities should be addressing structural change in this country, and should be addressing the economic needs of Black people that have to change. It cannot be that still in 2022, Black people live in dehumanizing poverty. Those are the kind of things that we should be addressing, and we should be dealing with, finding practical ways to change that, because racism is given power by capitalism. And when you have this continuous capitalism where economic power lies in the hands of a white male minority, then you're going to continue to have racism, because you have no power to structurally change our circumstances. And so we must address the economic issues in our country in order to also address the racial issues in our country, because those are tied together. Because I cannot emphasize this even more. Racism gets power from capitalism.
All right, let me try and bring in Asanda again. All right, I think she is unable to speak to us at the moment. But Zulaikha, let me end with you then. Looking at the term that, a lot of freedom fighters used to say back then, saying that South Africa must belong to all who live in it. Clearly, that's not where we are at the moment. It doesn't belong to everybody.
No, absolutely. Clearly, South Africa doesn't belong to all of those who live in it. Currently, South Africa belongs to a minority of people who live in it, whilst the majority has no access of ownership in part of this South Africa. And that's not where we're at currently. And I think that And I think that once we can continue to go into the economic issues, looking at ownership for Black South Africans, changing the economic circumstances of Black people, and also being able, once we are able to address the economic, and Black people have some form of economic power as well in this country, we might be able to change our structural circumstances in the country. And if we can address the structural issues in the country, then I believe that we might pave a way forward into the eradication of racism in this country. And also, other than structural change, because one thing that I've learned post coming out of Pretoria Girls High, it's not enough that you change policies, because yes, we managed to change the policy in Pretoria High School for girls, but till today, it still has issues of racism, right? And that's primarily because institutions are also upheld by cultures and traditions, and those cultures and traditions are sustained by people. It's not only the policies and the laws that must change, also people must change. And so we must also be talking and engaging, and we must also encourage people to change, and through forms of educating people on racism, because in school children are taught that racism is a thing of the past. That's how they're socialized, right? And that's not something realistic about their society, right? And we mainly tend to focus that education on Black children. And I think that if we can also begin to educate people, I think that we would also be paving a way forward for people changing, because these traditions that uphold these institutions, like, for example, we're talking about your historically white-only institutions, right? Your likes of Stellenbosch, UP, where these constant incidents of racism always repeat themselves, right? Where you've got these horrible, revolting traditions of initiation, where Black students must be initiated into the university, or you've got these traditions where one feels they must terrorize a Black student by urinating on their possessions, right? Such form part of these traditions that uphold these institutions, which must be eradicated completely. And I think that there needs to be a focus as well on the socialization within institutions as well. There must be a direct focus on changing and eradicating these traditions and cultures which are exclusionary and also are deeply, deeply racist.
All right. Thank you so much, Zulaikha, for speaking to us here on All Angles. That was Zulaikha Patel. She's an activist. You might remember her from those protests at Pretoria High School for girls around their hair policies. Earlier on, we also had Asanda Ngoasheng. She is a diversity expert. Let's take